Even as a baby, Daniel was an irritable, moody, and inflexible child. Unlike his sister, who had been content, Daniel was angry and unpredictable. As a toddler, Daniel was always on the go with more energy than he knew what to do with. At home, he wanted constant attention and seemed unable to play on his own. He was noisy, destructive, and naughty, and some days seemed like an endless torrent of disobedience, backchat, rudeness, name-calling, and aggression. Daniel would scream and shout for hours if he couldn't get his way, and he would lash out at anyone and anything that got in his way. Daniel seemed to get angry so easily about everything and nothing, and hit, kicked, and punched anyone who got in his way. Because of his behavior, he was nicknamed Demolition Dan, and he was referred to as this red-faced angry monster. Daniel was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 6 years, and his story was narrated by his mother, Alison Thompson, in the aptly titled memoir, The Boy from Hell, Life with a Child with ADHD. Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to another episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, which explores the theme of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, sometimes called attention deficit disorder. What followed Daniel's diagnosis was described by his mother as 12 years of battles with schools, 2 permanent exclusions, an educational tribunal, brushes with the law, and the emotional journey that ended with a statement of educational needs and a place in a special school. Daniel also exhibited other disturbing behaviors. For example, his mother wrote about his Jekyll and Hyde mood swings, his incredible Hulk-like temper tantrums, his fearlessness, his defiance, and his inflexibility. But perhaps more suggestive of his diagnosis were his impulsiveness, his easy distractibility, his fidgetiness, his inability to take turns, and his tendency to be messy for the sake of it. Daniel's misbehavior went beyond the home and became disruptive in school. This was where he showed lack of concentration, general disobedience, and increasing aggression. ADHD is a rather nebulous condition, and this is highlighted by the ADHD experts Edward Hallowell and John Ratey in their book titled Driven to Distraction. There, they noted the difficulty of demarcating where normal behavior leaves off and this syndrome begins. They wrote that we do not yet have one concise definition for ADD, and that ADD comes in many shapes and sizes and has much variability. Indeed, one chapter in their book was titled Parts of the Elephant, referring to the popular proverb. This fuzziness is further illustrated by Thom Hartmann in his book titled ADHD, A Hunter in a Farmer's World. Hartmann argued that ADHD is not an all-or-nothing diagnosis, explaining that there appears to be a curve of behaviors and personality types ranging from extremely non-ADHD to extremely ADHD. The diagnosis of ADHD is therefore not always a straightforward affair. To further muddy the waters, Hallowell and Ratey describe 13 subtypes of adult ADHD, pointing out that probably a half dozen clinical syndromes are camouflaged under the one diagnostic umbrella term, ADD. They also listed 20 diagnostic criteria items for ADHD. This list included distractibility, impulsivity, restlessness, a sense of underachievement, disorganization, procrastination, a search for high stimulation, easy tendency to boredom, difficulty following proper procedure, low tolerance for frustration, and addictive behavior. According to Russell Barkley and colleagues in their book titled ADHD in Adults, What the Science Says, the history of our understanding of ADHD goes back to 1902 when physician George Still presented a series of lectures to the Royal College of Physicians in which he reported 43 children who had difficulty sustaining attention and controlling their bad behavior. Barkley and colleagues wrote that most of Still's patients were not only inattentive and lacking in forethought, but also quite overactive, and that they were also frequently aggressive, defiant, resistant to discipline, and excessively emotional or passionate, and showing little inhibitory volition over their behavior. Significantly, Barkley and colleagues also wrote that many of Still's patients had a penchant for lawlessness, spitefulness, cruelty, and dishonesty. Less recognized features of ADHD were explored by Hartmann. For example, he discussed the problem people with ADHD have with time, such as distortions of time sense and even time blindness. He explained that most non-ADHD people describe time as a fairly consistent and linear flow, but those with ADHD have an exaggerated sense of urgency when they are on a task and an exaggerated sense of boredom when they feel they have nothing to do. Hartmann also discussed the difficulty people with ADHD have with auditory processing, giving rise to problems with understanding directions. What is the pathology driving ADHD? This was a theme that was also explored by Hartmann, who pointed to the thalamus as the most likely source of ADHD behaviors. He explained that all of our senses except smell flow into a small structure near the base of the brain called the thalamus, a structure which he said acts in much the same way as a faucet does on a sink or as a graphic equalizer on a stereo system. He wrote that one of the more interesting recent medical discoveries is the fact that each one of us has a slightly different normal baseline setting for how open or closed the faucet of our thalamus is. He said people with a wide open thalamic faucet experience sight, sound, touch, and taste strongly and vividly. And on the other end of the spectrum, he said, are those people whose thalamus and RAS are not as open. Less sensory information flows through, or it flows through with a lower intensity. He added that these people see, hear, taste, and feel less vividly, and that rather than trying to push themselves away from the world, they throw themselves into it, often with an intensity that is bewildering to the open faucet thalamus folks. It is in this context that he explained why stimulants work in ADHD by opening up the faucet, heightening the sensory experience, and thereby suppressing the urge to seek for stimulation. Several risk factors have been fingered for ADHD, and these include maternal smoking, maternal alcohol consumption, prenatal brain injury, and low birth weight. One of the greatest misconceptions of ADHD is that it is a childhood condition. This is unfortunate because many adults suffer with undiagnosed ADHD. We now know that ADHD affects 3 to 10% of children, but it persists into adulthood in 10 to 60% of these cases. In this way, therefore, ADHD affects 4.5% of all adults, a very large proportion. Take the case of Tom Nardone, who documented his experience in the book titled Chasing Kites, a memoir about growing up with ADHD. Nardone particularly captured the perturbations that people with adult ADHD experience in their occupational lives. In the 2 years that followed after he left the Navy, Nardone said he would have more than 40 different jobs. He wrote that getting the job was never the problem, but that shortly after getting a job, I would find myself looking for a new one, for silly reasons such as it was just so boring or that my boss was rude to me one day. Indeed, in one case, he said he quit because I had to sit in traffic for 15 minutes every afternoon when I left to go home. And at other times, he had been fired because, as he said, I was unable or unwilling to perform at the level I was expected to. Another memoir that explored the variegated occupational lives of people with ADHD in adulthood was that of Alistair Bryn Williams, titled Navigating ADHD in Men, Thriving with a Late Diagnosis. Williams described how jobs that seemed exciting at first quickly became monotonous. He said, I hopped from one position to another, always seeking that elusive, perfect fit. And when he found traditional employment became too stifling, he said, I turned to entrepreneurship, starting a series of businesses that allowed me to channel my creative energy and avoid the confines of a 9-to-5 routine. But, he said, even here my ADHD caught up with me. Paperwork piled up, tax returns went unfiled, and the day-to-day operations of my own restaurants became overwhelming. Other job-related difficulties of ADHD that William highlighted included inconsistent performance, difficulty with long-term projects, and trouble with budgeting, impulsive spending, or keeping track of bills and expenses. Another account of the occupational disruption caused by ADHD is that of Emily Farris, titled I'll Just Be 5 More Minutes, and Other Tales from My ADHD Brain. Farris was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 35 years, and a major manifestation in her case was dealing with paperwork, what she said people saw as a character flaw. She said that my paperwork problem is technically an executive dysfunction, a term used by mental health practitioners to describe difficulties with cognitive, organizational, and emotional tasks. Farris also had a variegated occupational history, as we have seen with other people with ADHD. For example, she wrote that I've worked in media for most of my career, but it's been an ever-changing combination of mostly freelance jobs: lifestyle writer, copywriter, graphic designer, food stylist, branded content writer, commerce writer, recipe developer, social media consultant, editor, cookbook publicist, cocktail photographer, while also dabbling in interior design and teaching myself how to edit video and audio. Nardone expressed the typical relief and understanding that comes on the back of realizing that ADHD explained his life difficulties. Another person who illustrated this relief was Natalie Lane. Lane was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 27 years, and she said, "This is where my life began." Writing in her memoir titled The ADHD Fight, a book on the struggles with ADHD and why they happen, she said, "It was almost as if I never knew who I really was until that day, and it enabled me to understand why I do some of the things I do." Another destructive dimension of adult ADHD is on the domestic and relationship fronts. Farris, for example, characterized most aspects of her life as messy. She wrote that my life is messy, my relationship is messy, my house is messy, my finances are incredibly messy, I am messy. This theme is also comprehensively explored by Sandra Arnau-Dewar in her memoir titled Desperately Seeking Novelty, a memoir about ADHD. Arnau-Dewar wrote that all of my life I've felt that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. She said, my mind was like a rotating Ferris wheel, spinning round and round and round, and that she was constantly moving, constantly speaking, unable to sleep at night or sit quietly in class. Poor school attendance is one manifestation of ADHD that Arnau-Dewar highlighted. She said this began in the 7th grade and that she perfected elaborate excuses to avoid going to school, such as her head or stomach hurting. She said, "My absences are so frequent that the dean of girls even calls my mother to complain." Arnau-Dewar also had a checkered employment history. She wrote that employers found her behavior problematic, saying, "I can't count the number of times that I have been fired, sometimes on the first day." With regards to relationships, Arnau-Dewar wrote that parents of children with ADHD are twice as likely to divorce, adding that raising children with ADHD puts enormous stress on a marriage. She also acknowledged that her own hyperactive ADHD behavior added stress to her own mother. Another relationship dimension of ADHD is in making friends. Arnau-Dewar recalled the difficulties she herself had in making friends in school, saying that she was rebuffed by the girls in her classes, perhaps because I talked too much and failed to listen. Arnau-Dewar also cited research findings confirming that girls with ADHD found that they had fewer friends and were more frequently the target of peer rejection and bullying. Arnau-Dewar's account also highlighted a significant feature of ADHD, its tendency to increase the risk of committing crimes. For example, she wrote of how she discovered that her own father had been convicted of 60 counts of forgery, for which he was sentenced to 5 years in jail. She said, "My father's criminal behavior makes me to wonder if he had ADHD." She wrote that his numerous forgery offenses suggest that he was an impulsive daredevil and lacked foresight and a moral compass. She supported this by citing prison studies which, she said, show that inmates have a high rate of ADHD, ranging from 24 to 67% compared to the general population rate of less than 5%. Criminality is, however, a minor aspect of ADHD for the vast majority of those who have it. Indeed, on the other hand, many people with ADHD report on the positive aspects of ADHD. For example, Arnau-Dewar cited reports that show that novelty seekers offer bold solutions that timid members might not consider, and that they serve as canaries in the mine. She also cited resilience as an advantage of ADHD, suggesting that her own ADHD may have helped her to overcome family trauma. In her memoir titled Me, Myself and ADHD, Molly Brooks Dridge explored other benefits she attributed to ADHD, such as the abilities to express emotions and to fit into a variety of different groups. Some of the strengths of people with ADHD that William discussed were creative thinking, problem solving, and handling crisis situations. And despite his disruptive behaviors, Daniel's mother also highlighted many of his positive attributes. She wrote, for example, that from an early age, and despite his own poor behavior, Daniel has always had a strong sense of right and wrong, of justice and fairness. A paradoxical advantage of having ADHD is that of hyperfocus. For example, as a child, Farris said, "I'd often get late night bursts of inspiration that kept me up doing crafty projects way past my bedtime." She said, "Once we become hyperfixated or hyperfocused on a particular project or task, it consumes our attention, often at the expense of everything else in our lives, including eating, sleeping, showering, and sometimes even getting up to pee." She, however, saw this ability to hyperfocus as a real asset because she said, "Once I resolve to do something, I will hyperfocus on it until I decide I'm done, even or especially if it's outside my skill set when I begin." An even deeper perspective of the positive dimensions of ADHD was provided by Hartmann. Drawing similarities between hunters and people with ADHD in this context, he argued that people with ADHD are the descendants of hunters, explaining that hunters have to be constantly scanning their environment, looking for food and for threats to them. That's distractibility. Hartmann explained that people with ADHD are also easily distracted because they are constantly monitoring the scene and that they notice everything that's going on and particularly notice changes or quickly changing things in their environment. He compared this with the behavior of hunters who, he said, have to make instant decisions and act on them without a second's thought when they are chasing or being chased through the forest or jungle, which is impulsivity. Hartmann also viewed people with ADHD as risk takers who drive innovation by acting as the spark plugs of our society. It is in this context that he said one could easily recharacterize ADHD and non-ADHD persons as hunters and farmers. He therefore lamented that human societies today, populated by farmers and office and factory workers, tend to punish and discourage hunter and warrior behavior. He went on to argue that ADHD behaviors have been inappropriately pathologized and society needs to be restructured to accommodate people with these behaviors. Two phenomena make the diagnosis of ADHD a complex process. The first is the tendency for the condition to be associated with other disorders. ADHD is indeed rarely a standalone diagnosis in those it afflicts. For example, Daniel's final diagnosis was ADHD with Asperger's syndrome, while Nardone was given a diagnosis of ADHD and bipolar disorder. Other psychiatric comorbidities of ADHD are anxiety, depression, substance use disorder, personality disorder, binge eating, and trichotillomania, that is, tendency to pull out the hair. Another condition that is strongly linked with ADHD is Tourette's syndrome. According to Aribert Rothenberger and Veit Rosner in their book titled Tourette's Syndrome, ADHD is the most common comorbidity in Tourette's syndrome, estimated to affect about 60% of cases. Other neurological comorbidities of ADHD are epilepsy, restless leg syndrome, cataplexy, disturbed sleep, insomnia, cognitive impairment, and learning disability. The second phenomenon that complicates the ADHD diagnostic process is the long list of its mimics, both social and medical. For example, Hallowell and Ratey referred to the concept of pseudo-ADD, suggesting that the features of ADHD are like what obtains in modern American culture and temperament. A lot of hunters, I suppose. The treatment of ADHD has several prongs. First are coping strategies such as reliance on checklists and electronic planners. Second are non-drug treatments, which include psychotherapy, cognitive behavior therapy or CBT, social skills training, and anger management. And third are drug treatments, which include the stimulants methylphenidate, amphetamine mixed salts, and lisdexamfetamine dimesylate. And there are also the non-stimulants atomexetin and alpha-2 adrenergic agonist. Arnau-Dewar's account portrayed the effect of Ritalin on her adopted son, saying that it was miraculous. She said, "Within an hour of swallowing the first pill, I noticed a change. My wild, unruly child can suddenly sit still and listen." Daniel was also treated with Ritalin, and his mother said the transformation was amazing. Within about 15 minutes of taking the medication, she said, you could physically see him relax and calm down and become attentive and cooperative. And as he grew older, she said, it made a huge difference to his life. Nardone, on the other hand, was prescribed Adderall, a combination of two amphetamines, and the effect was almost immediate. He said, I noticed the absence of a fog in my head. I was not even aware of it ever being in my life until it was gone. It just seemed to vanish. He added that he noticed a very strange and unfamiliar sense of alertness. I had an immediate feeling I was now able to do things. I just felt right and in control. A further benefit of treatment, Nardone reported, was the absence of irritability. He said, I remember feeling happy and I was not worried about anything. And he said, things were different at work as well. He said, I started working right away. Normally, I would just sit around with everybody else and do nothing until Yvonne would tell us where to go work. I did not wait for instructions. I knew what needed to happen and I got busy working on it. The full effect of treatment was not sustained, however, but he said I was still light years ahead of where I was before taking medication. To explore the lived experience of ADHD, I will be speaking to Catherine Ellison, the author of Buzz, in the next episode of the podcast. Thank you very much for watching or listening to the podcast. If you found it helpful or enlightening, why not click on the like button, or better still, subscribe to the podcast YouTube or Spotify channels so that you don't miss subsequent episodes. And whilst waiting for these next episodes, do check my book called Surfing the Brain, and why not explore my website called Neuro Checklist. Until the next episode, thank you very much for your time.